Great. Well, I wonder if you guys had as busy day as I did. Yeah? Busy day? Good day? Good day? You've met at least one new person, right? There's a quiz. There's a quiz. Okay, great. Thank you for coming to today's closing session. We have Dr. Andrew Bredenkamp, who is going to speak to you again about his personal journey and why content is important and how it saves lives. I will preface by saying Andrew and I are both on the board for Translators Without Borders, and Andrew happens to be the chairman of the board right now, so he can talk about it. We'll let him talk about it. And please give a round of applause for Andrew as he talks about when language really matters.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to try and not walk about, which is my natural predilection, but I'll try and stay put. So, I wanted to talk about this. This is not really about my personal journey. This is about a personal journey which I think is relevant to us all, which is why I wanted to tell you about it. And it relates to the work we're doing on Translators Without Borders, helping to communicate effectively in some really life-changing, life-saving situations. So that's kind of the context to it. And some of it's a little bit personal, but I hope that it applies to everyone in the room and will give you pause for thought and maybe cause to action. So I'll come back to that at the end. So as I'm sure all of you know, in April of this year, a massive earthquake hit Nepal, and Nepal is a country that has a fairly limited infrastructure. Nevertheless, as everywhere on the planet nowadays, there are a lot of people out there who use Twitter, Facebook, all sorts of social media. Not many of them using email or whatever, but very shortly after the earthquake hit, people were reaching out to the social universe and talking. And as you can see from this message, this is important. You can see that it's important because it ends in an exclamation mark. I don't know how many people in the audience can read Devanagari. Can anybody in the audience read this? I can't see if there's any hands going up. One? A few. Okay. So very shortly after the earthquake hit, this kind of message started to be out there. We, as in the rest of the world, was receiving these messages. But as you will have no doubt noticed, this isn't accessible to us because it's not in a language that all of us understand. And it's not in a language that the crisis response organizations understand either. Doesn't really matter so much if we don't get it, perhaps. But if you're trying to help these people, then you want to know how to help them. So think of that challenge. And, I can't get this clicker right in my head. The buttons are the wrong way around. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. But try and keep that challenge at the front of your mind while I talk about some other things that I think are important around how we communicate effectively. And I'm going to try and pick up some of the best practices, the things that are important in communicating effectively at a very large scale, in a very agile fashion, that we can then use to help people like Buwan, who's writing to us and asking for help. And the reason I'm doing this is kind of talking about my personal journey. When I was first approached to help with the work of Translators Without Borders, I had never imagined that all the first world skills that I had, that I developed over 25, 30 years of working in large-scale global content, that they would be relevant in any kind of humanitarian context at all. I had always assumed that if I wanted to be contributing to humanitarian efforts, I would have to give them money. And money remains a good thing, by the way. Don't let me create the impression we don't need money to help people. We do, and Translators Without Borders will be very welcome for any donations. But what I want to bring over today is how some of the things that we're good at in this industry, communicating with people effectively, putting our target audience in the center of what we do, how those things are important in helping Buan and others in crisis situations. So think about the global situation, think about content, think about global teams working together on tough language problems. This kind of sums up my professional life. This is what I've done since before I started Acrolinks. This is the kind of issues that I think is interesting. Keeping in mind not necessarily the language problem, but just big groups of people all trying to collaborate on something, and using improvised technology, Skype and Twitter and Facebook and whatever to try and get the job done. Too often, effective communication becomes just a thing we all take for granted. And this is the obligatory Dilbert cartoon that you have to have in the last presentation of a day of very deep talks. But this highlights the idea of how difficult it is sometimes to remind people or keep it at the front of mind when you're talking about a particular challenge, that communication is important. Quite often people they say, I've got this job to do, right? I'm sitting in my helicopter and I have to go and help those people whose houses have fallen down or who've had a mudslide or whatever. I can't worry about content right now. I have to get in my helicopter and go somewhere. Where am I going? Well, that's another problem. Now imagine this in our professional world. You know, you're trying to do something. What we're trying to do is very important to us, but we need information, we need content, we need help in doing that. This is constantly the challenge of how to remind people how important content is in everything we do. And as we talk about crisis response, it's the same issue over and over again. More people die of lack of information than lack of medication, right? They don't know how to save themselves. They don't know simple things that can keep their water clean, that can stop them from getting infectious diseases, that can, for example, in the Ebola crisis that I talked about last year. So these things are the importance of content in playing a central role in every organization's activities is something that's relevant for us all. But of course, one of the big issues with content is that people's reaction, we've heard this a few times today, people's instant reaction is to create more of it. I need some content to support whatever it is I'm doing, so I'm going to write some content. I'm going to tell you everything I know, or everything I imagine at this particular moment you might want to know. And of course, everyone then gets buried in crap. They get buried in, and this has been one of the things that the content marketing world has suffered from. The content marketing is marketing fueled by content, right? For those of you that haven't been following the trend. But of course, the overwhelming instinct to create more content because I need content to fuel my marketing means then you end up with too much content again. And this is a great presentation. You can find it on SlideShare by Doug Kessler, who early on, this is more than a year old now, I think, talks about how more is not necessarily the best response in these situations. If you look at what the Content Marketing Institute is doing, they have evolved to the point where having initially prioritized quantity above everything else, their main concern was, how do we get enough content? How can I create enough content? Measuring their success by saying, how many blog articles do I have this week? How fast am I going? Instead of that, there's now been a realization that what we really need to be thinking about is, are we engaging our audience? Right? And the second point here, I'll come back to again, how do we do that consistently? So on the consistency side, we've been looking at analyzing the way organizations are doing this at the moment. And we released this impact index. You can get it off our website if you're interested. Hundreds of millions of words of content that we look at and look at the consistency of that over a whole range of different kinds of contents. Product content, support content, marketing content, etc. And we can see how the commercial organizations whose commercial success is driven by content, how badly they're doing. All these little red dots are companies who are below this benchmark threshold that we've learned over time indicates an acceptable level of quality. Only 31% of the companies manage to get above that line consistently. This is a global problem. I talked about the impact of content on company performance, on organization performance. You can see here that there is a correlation over time between the scoring, the way the score of the content that companies are putting out will correlate over time with the ability to improve your reputation. So the Alexa score, these are the Alexa website rankings, which is a kind of a generic measure of your influence or reputation on the web. Those companies who consistently perform badly on their content scores are showing a downward trend in their Alexa scores, and those ones with higher scores are showing an upward trend. So this shows broadly, very broadly, broad brush as you can get, how content quality, content scoring, content performance is the fuel for a company's success. To get this down from a very high level to a very low level, think of two individual pieces of content. So this is 2 blog posts, actually from the same company, 2 real blog posts that came out. And well, not going to go into the details of why they were different, other than to think about the scores that they generated. And you can see, you can probably see at the back the kind of scores that they were getting. The one on I can't do left and right. The one on this side got significantly worse scores in a number of categories. And when we look at the performance of that, the social performance was 700% different between from the poor article to the good article. Social sharing is not the only metric of quality, of course, but if you're talking about a performance-related definition of quality, then this is a pretty good indication that for a blog, social sharing is a very good indicator that something is happening, something good is happening. So consistency in the way you communicate is extremely important, looking at all the different kinds of content as we go. So what we've seen is that companies are doing this, in principle, you would think this looks like a fairly good score. 46% are delivering consistent quality in their outbound facing content. The problem is that 27% are actually delivering consistently bad quality. So only 19%, just less than a fifth of the companies we looked at were able to deliver consistent high-quality content. And 13% managed to be not only extremely inconsistent, but of poor quality. In other words, starting about here and going downwards from there. So think of this in terms of the customer journey, how you're getting through, all the different touch points as you go through. You're in for a very bumpy ride, and not something that's going to make your customers happy, and not something that's going to make them come back to you. Now, consistency might sound like an airy-fairy goal, and we've talked about the idea of, obviously quality tracking. But what is quality tracking with success? How does consistency track with success? So this is from a result from a survey by McKinsey, who showed the variation in consistency. So if you look at the axis on the bottom, is showing the consistency. And this is the low to the left is a high standard deviation. On the right is a low standard deviation. So the more variation in the consistency, the lower the customer satisfaction. So the more consistent your content is, the higher your customer satisfaction. You can see that trending up, the correlation between the two. So I wanted to go into the details of one particular organization that I think is doing this very well. Doing this, communicating, planning, thinking about their content, putting the customer in the middle. And doing it at a scale that I think is really impressive. So IBM is a big company. I think that's no news to you, but just to think of it in terms of the workforce that they have, IBM is equal to Google and Oracle and Apple and Microsoft and 5 Facebooks all together. This is a huge team of people to marshal, to put together, to coordinate, to get them to speak with one voice as an organization and communicate successfully. They have very complex products that they need to get out to their market. So how do they do this? Well, I talked about the 3 C's relating to customer experience at lunchtime. I'm going to give you 3 P's now. I like to do things in threes. Everyone always makes fun of me, but anyway, I'm going to keep doing it. The first P is personas, to think about who is our target audience. Personas get a bad press, but I will stick with them forever because they put the reader, the target audience, right in the head. That's what they're trying. If they're done well, that's what they're doing. What I particularly like about IBM's approach to personas is that it's data-driven. They don't just sit around in a meeting drinking coffee and thinking, well, who should we be writing for? Who should we try and target? They look at the data and they sit down and they say, who is consuming our content now? And where do we need to give them more? And if enough types of people, if enough people that fit into one bucket or category, I know that none of us like to think of being in buckets, but we are all in buckets of some kind. If there's enough people who behave in a particular way, then let's create a persona, a type of person who does a type of thing, a type of target audience that we want to be talking to, that we want to be creating content for. So this is a really healthy way of thinking about your target audiences and what you're going to do with it. The second P is path. To think about the customer journey. And again, not something where you sit down and let's draw a customer journey. Let's just sit down and work out what these stages might be. And there are millions of them out there. You Google for images of the customer journey. You'll find hundreds of horrible PowerPoints of, blob, arrow, blob, arrow, blob, arrow as you go through, or maybe a circle because people come back and buy stuff. None of that bears very much relation to reality. You have things like I'm aware, and then I'm interested, and then I'm going to buy, and then I'm going to come back and buy. None of that really happens. What typically happens is much more like what we see on the on whatever side that is of the slide. It's a random journey. It's like a pinball machine with people bouncing around all over the place, and they're reading pieces of support content. They're reading pieces of they're reading peer reviews by other people. They're reading case studies by someone else describing some other aspect of it. They're bouncing around. You'll see the little gray dots, the end points on here. These are the inflection points where I bounce from one place to another and I start to follow another path. Now, you'd like that path to end up with the person buying something, but it's going to be very hard to predict. Just by thinking about it, going to be very hard to predict when I'm going to get there. So instead, what IBM is doing is, again, data-driven, thinking about what kinds of, you're not supposed to be able to read this before you start. There's what kinds of things happen and what kinds of content do people consume. Again, this is a process. The customer journey is fueled by content, it's driven by content. Just like, and I'm going to show you in a minute, saving lives is driven by content. This is a whole process that's modeled by content. It's data-driven. All the decision-making in here is driven by data. None of it is just made up in meetings by people in darkened rooms. The third P is performing. But excuse my pronunciation, I'm from England, north of England. I apologize. But anyway, all of the stuff I've talked about is data-driven. Now, in order to do that, you need to be able to measure stuff. And before you start measuring things like crazy, you have to work out what it is we're trying to measure. And I wish I had some unit of currency for every time people had told me their metric for success was that they were going to do a certain amount of things. And, you know, it kind of makes me sad, but it makes me think that at least there's some work for us still to do. What you see here, again, you're not supposed to be able to read this, but what you see here are definitions of success that they have done, that IBM has done here. These are recipes for things that we will use to evaluate whether we're being successful or not. These recipe books then give you things that you can go out and measure. Don't start measuring until you've worked out what would be an important metric. Otherwise, you just start measuring stuff like crazy and you build BI applications, and there are millions of them, but you don't know whether any of these numbers are relevant or not. You're just collecting numbers. So a common definition of a success is important because you'll find that one department is creating content and measuring it in one way. They might be measuring clicks, or they might be measuring, I don't know, how long people are on the page, or they might be measuring social sharing or whatever. If every organization within the company has a different metric, a different way of measuring success, there is no chance that you will be able to do this strategically. So what they've done is they've worked out common ways of defining success, sharing those success criteria, and saying this is how we're going to know whether we've been successful or not. And then, of course, you can roll that out. Once you have a definition of what success means, you can start to measure quality. Quality is just a measure of how close we are to being, how successful we are being, based on those definitions of success that I have. So a piece of content is successful if it increases customer satisfaction or drives more conversions or gets people to move from one stage to another, gets people on the basis of having read this to give me their email address or to give me to read a white paper or whatever. Whatever your success metrics are, you can then create quality. Quality is a meaningless concept on its own. It's just defined by am I successful according to whatever my definition of a success is. So what I've tried to talk about here and I'm going to wrap up with why this is relevant, why these concepts of putting the reader in the middle, driven by data, why this is important in saving lives. So back to Nepal. When we get this kind of message, what do? Well, the first thing we have to do is be prepared to receive this kind of message. Otherwise, it's just going to disappear into the ether and get lost. So one of the P's I could have added is planning. because an important part of this is to know what your process is, know who your target audience is, and think about how we're going to reach them. In order to do that, the first thing we need to do is to work out in a crisis situation is where is the crisis and what language do they speak in that crisis hit area. Now in Nepal they speak 22 languages. You can't just translate everything into Nepali and hope that that works, because as you can see from these numbers, depending on where you are, Nepali might not even be the majority language. So we ended up on the basis of this. We work with a partner of ours called Map Action, who delivers map overlays. They take a map, and on the top of the map, they will put the crisis data on top of that. Where has the earthquake caused the most damage? And on top of that, they can put language data, saying this is the language that these people speak. So on the basis of that data, we decided that our target audience was going to mainly be focused around Nepali and Newari, which you can see Newari is in the 6th column. It wouldn't be a column, it wouldn't be a language you would choose if you weren't paying attention to the data. So we took Nepali and Newari, we added Hindi because Hindi is an important lingua franca, especially for people on the move. And we quickly gathered a task force, a rapid response team from across the planet, so we could work 24/7, of people who would be able to give us translations in those languages. This was all run through very low-tech solutions. We have a higher level platform, but most of the interaction, most of the building is done through Twitter and Skype and Facebook. The social media that people are comfortable with, and the social media we can get a massive coverage with across the planet. So we have a team, we have a plan as far as the target audience is concerned. We take that and we start to work out what is it that these people want to know about. So you can think of this as your messaging framework for your marketing campaign. This is what we need to do, we have a whole message library for particular types of crisis situation. Here you can see, for those of you who can't read that, it says things like abandoned and accident and ambulance, antibiotics, depending on the type of crisis. We've worked in, as I said, in Ebola and other disease crisis situations. We've worked in hurricane situations. Depending on the type of crisis situation, you'll need a different vocabulary, a different set of words and phrases that are important for you. We quickly translated those into the relevant languages that we'd picked for our target, or we had been told were relevant for our target audience. We then go out and go back and start to listen to the community, to our target audience. We listen first, and then we're in a position to pick up these kinds of messages and decode them by looking for the things that people are asking for. We look for cries for help, basically, or information that's important, that's on the ground telling us what's going on. And we use that, we feed that back into the crisis platforms so that crisis response organizations, in this case, the Indian Army, but it could be the International Red Cross federations, it could be the UN, whoever. All these people are partners of ours in this same framework. We can deliver. What's happened here is that we use a backend on Twitter to geolocate the message, and then we can translate it into the language. We pull out the coordinates, and we put those coordinates into a situation report that goes into the platform. So you can imagine how from zero communication, we've actually given people data that they can use. When they get in their helicopters, they can go places. And on the basis of that, people were getting in their helicopters, specifically, one of these cases, specifically the Indian Army, were saying that they were monitoring these messages particularly for guiding their helicopter pilots to tell them where were the highest priority places for them to go and drop aid. So suddenly a cry for help in a language that the crisis response teams cannot respond to is suddenly actionable, something they can do something with. I've taken far too much of your time, but I would plead with you. Scott will tell you more details tomorrow about the organization and tell you how to help. Money is a good way to help, and Scott will tell you tomorrow about where to send your money. We're organizing events here in Silicon Valley that you can attend. So please help, and please think about this. Money is one way, but also people who have professional expertise in these areas of getting content, organizing content, getting the right content to the right people at the right time. This is something you are good at, and that you as a community can use to save people's lives. Thank you very much.